everyone, welcome back to Eye of the Crown. We are going to do a deep dive analysis on the character Dre, a young woman who's obsessed with a pop star from the TV movie series Swarm. Now, it took me some time to really get clarity on what I wanted to say here because there's so much buzz, check the innuendo, on this movie series and all of the hype about, sex scenes and things like that. But I really started to unlock and unveil some of the things that I really want to say about it, and specifically Dre. So if you've noticed the title of this is embarking on a psychological deep dive into a state of limerence and infatuation due to anxious, preoccupied, and fearful avoidant attachment styles. Woo! That is a mouthful. Okay, so the idea here is to not look at the series at all, but to study Dre, a young woman who's obsessed with a pop star. And the aesthetic of the pop star is very similar to Beyonce, with a fan base known as the Swarm. Now, we're not actually talking at all about the synopsis, the plot, or anything like that. What we're doing is studying the mentality of the character Dre. And I want to talk about certain things that lead to this psychological breakdown that I think will help a lot of people. One of the things I want to focus on, this is going to be a bit of a dig into colorism, but if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. The reason to cast very specific characters, Dominique Fishback as Andrea Dre Green is a more brown-skinned, dark-skinned character versus Chloe Bailey, who is playing Marissa Jackson, who is leaning more towards the light-skinned arena. And I want you guys to think about how this plays out in daily pop culture, where in colorism specifically, the Black community still struggles with this psychologically in choosing a more lighter-skinned, toned person to be the state of muse or adoration. And while it doesn't seem like Dre wanted to necessarily be or wanted to be Marissa, there's levels of infatuation between Marissa. Her life is deeply centered around Marissa and only two people, Marissa and Khalid, who's played by Damson Idris, in which Dre exhibits those infatuations. Now, there's certain people who will say that this is due to maybe a more sexual infatuation, which, infatuation actually probably is more of the foundation of sexual infatuation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual. When we look at how much Dre is obsessed with the pop star, that also may not be sexual infatuation, but it's infatuation nonetheless. And I wanted to talk about how these situations actually play out in reality, in real life. And I don't really want to say that Donald Glover was trying to make this theory, but I am, basically. So when we look at the state of limerence is a need to be romantically, like magical romance, versus this idea of somebody who is really in love with you. And quite often, limerence, you lose yourself completely. It's beyond loss of self. It's a real diagnosis that many people suffer from due to childhood neglect. And so the state of mind results into romantic or non-romantic feelings for another person, but it starts to be intrusive. The thoughts are melancholic, and sometimes it's a tragic concern for people when they see somebody in a state of limerence for another person. A clear indicator of these types of attachments is the need to defend somebody almost to the point of delusion or self-delusion, in the scene where Dre stands up for her favorite idol that, she's naturally defending because she loves them, but it starts to go off center. It starts to go a little bit darker, and she's almost accusatory in ways that the guy is not really saying about her favorite idol. So these are one of the signs, is these overly defensive and then turning to offensive means of standing for that person, their ideal person. And this also is the connection to the bees and the idea that bees can swarm you, that they can attack you, because bees in the natural habitat only really do attack when their hive, when especially their queen, is being attacked, right? So a bee really doesn't try to just outwardly sting you; they do it in the act of defense. So it matches the nature of things. And it can be a theory that limerence, preoccupied, and fearful avoidant attachments come from some sort of narcissistic abuse, or the emerging of narcissistic traits within the person who is neglected. And this is a theory of mine. When we look at how Dre responds to the guy when she is defending her idol versus the first scene, she has two different responses that are very common when studying people who have suffered narcissistic abuse. In the scene with the guy, she chooses to fight. Remember that. That first scene, like the way that her character reacts to the first scene, it's very much so a freeze reaction. So you have different reactions when you're in a dealing with like a narcissistic situation where you psychologically are figuring out how to respond. You have fawning, which is you fawn over somebody and you like really want to like please them. You have freeze, in which you're stuck and you can't move. You have fight, the typical fight where you do something about it, right? You confront them in more than likely a equal amount of rage to how you're feeling. Or you have flight, in which you run away. And I think that when we see that scene, that you actually see that Dre responds in a freeze response. So a lot of people aren't really focused on the psychology, but I think that it's something to definitely talk about in hopes to help people understand themselves and see how their own reactions are reflected on the screen. The freeze response is a response dealing with somebody who is showing very severe narcissistic behavior. And you can see that Dre responds that way, in which it's telling of the scene and it's also telling of the character Khalid, and how, if you would say, the backstory between Khalid and Dre is playing out. Okay, so the thing that you also want to consider is infatuation with Dre, and maybe Marissa and Khalid, or them separately and their relationship together. So infatuation, another state of being that quite happens to people who are very much so experiencing childhood neglect. And so what happens in childhood neglect is that children don't have somebody to guide them or give them any sort of real love and structure. And so what happens is that they will basically latch on to somebody who seems like an ideal person that they can trust and follow. And this person could be very far from that. It could be somebody who is not the parent, who's abusive. It could be another kid, so it could be another child. It could also be, especially when you find teenagers, it can be very well-known celebrities and idols. Okay, so this happens quite often, and you see that not all children, but a good amount of children do latch on to somebody in their like infatuated ideal, obsessed with a celebrity state. I know I have. And this is definitely a byproduct of some sort of neglect that the child did not have in their essential growing up stages. So it's not a healthy thing, but it's very rampant in our community. And going back to the colorism, this is why I wanted to bring this up, because I personally focus on astrology and and the spiritual community, right? So we focus on a lot of the spiritual manifestations of certain psychological states. Limerence actually has a very specific manifestation, and you find it sometimes in lighter skin tones. Now, this is not a statistic. I don't have any science behind this. I don't have anything to back me up, okay? So you guys tell me what you think, but you're going to find this in some light skin tones, but you find it very, very rampant in dark skin tones, which is the evoking of the lemur spirit, and that energy really manifests physically. It has these like hollowed out eyes, these darker circles, these need to like gaze out into almost the abyss. It almost looks like that freeze response, okay? And some people have it. Some people have it had it when they were kids. Some people still have it in their adult life. And that comes from this: when you're children, you're actually in a trance state. And when you find somebody that you latch on to, like children are very much so still in a dream state, right? So that's where that gaze comes from. And then when they latch onto something, they see it almost in its magical essence. And so they create this infatuation to the person. Now, a lot of people on YouTube will say that limerence is romantic love, but from what I've researched, it can be non-romantic and romantic. This is why you can obsess about a pop star and it not necessarily be that you want to be with them. Some people do, but some don't. And that's still a very strong sign of limerence. But limerence is probably a more psychological diagnosis of the basic idea of infatuation, but it takes it to another level. Now, what actually happens now is that you have also attachment styles that come out of limerence, and this is anxious preoccupied, and this is fearful avoidant. I think that we find that in Dre as well, that her energy seems to be very much so anxious, but I actually find her to be more fearful avoidant from the scenes that I've watched. And there's this need to not confront, right? And to not almost be present. Like when somebody's fearful avoidant, they're not really showing up in life. They're not really showing up in conversations. They're almost hiding behind the mask of themselves. So they're physically there, they're engaged with you, but they're not alive, they're not vital, right? And I don't think that that's always in fearful avoidance, but I think when we're looking at Dre, that you see this very often. Now, one of my favorite people is on YouTube, and she's from the Personal Development School, and she actually is an expert on attachment styles. But we find that one of the ways to detach yourself from a limerent state, from an infatuated state, and from any of these states is to actually think about what is it that this person is representing for you, and why are they in place of that. So when you look at like looking at a pop star, that pop star might be for Dre that they are well taken care of, they have really nice clothes, they are beautiful, right? And instead of seeing how one could obtain those traits in themselves, they are stuck in this state where it's all projected and it's all focused externally versus internally. Okay. And so this is when we have this issue of really self-neglect continuing the perpetuation of that state. And it's quite something to think about. It's something that I have personally experienced, and it's something that I know many other people do. So if you have found yourself to be in this type of state, I really suggest for you to not diagnose yourself and, victimize yourself to it, which is something that I've done too, from experience, but to start doing the work that you need to look at that thing that you're infatuated with and to figure out what are the traits that that person has that you are infatuated with. And that's when you can start taking those traits and giving them to yourself. And you're actually going to struggle with breaking apart from the infatuation. It may require you to not talk about them, to not have their whatever it is that you use to infatuate about them, to not be, to really just detach yourself healthfully from it. Some of the things that also happen in these infatuated attachments, limerence type of attachments, is that when the person does not supply they don't supply the thing that it seems like they're promising to you, you can have a very strong, angry response, but still be infatuated. Does that make sense? Basically, you are the person who's infatuated with that other person. Let's say it's a celebrity. Let's say it's a regular person that you're romantically interested in, right? If that person starts to show their human side and shows the non-ideals, you may have an even more overreaction to them, not just in defense of them, but to the thing that you idolize, because it's breaking your ideal that your inner child needs. It's clenching onto that ideal of that person. So what I would say is, instead of having a strong angry response and still be infatuated, use the anger to bring you into reality, making you see that this person does not have the thing that you thought that they did. It doesn't mean that they're a bad person. It just means that they're human and they're far from being put on a pedestal beyond what it is that you can do for yourself. Okay, because it's going to happen, because this happens. This is an ideal. It's not real, right? The infatuation is based off of an idea versus the real person. And so once that person delivers something that you can no longer really attach to, that's when the problem arises. And the only thing that I'll say about this movie in regards to Beyonce and the Beehive is I think there's an idea when the person that everyone idealizes literally continues to dish out perfectionism and the ideal. They continue to do that, and so it's really hard for people to stop the infatuation. And that might be the biggest thing that I see in the connections of the Beehive, Beyonce, and the movie Swarm, is that when we look at it psychologically, the actual idol, right, in reality has maintained a fairly decent score of delivering the ideal. And so this is probably why you get this connection here, in my opinion, to the psychological issues that happen around people who idolize someone. It's almost hard to say, because it's like, is the idol, the person who's the music artist, supposed to dim their light and make evident mistakes and almost show that they are absolutely nothing? They're supposed to, pull themselves down, pull their worth down so that people will stop attaching from them, right? Or is it the people that are attaching to them that need to recognize that they are in a state of possible infatuation, limerence, anxious, preoccupied, and or fearful, avoidant? And I do think it does help recognizing it's a co-creation, that the person who is being idealized can continue to strive for greatness, but also continue to be vulnerable with their human side and their weaknesses, that they don't have to listen to criticism, but they're open to the fact that people will criticize them. And I think this creates a healthier ego and expression of self, and also recognizing that one isn't immune to people's criticism, but they don't have to fall under it, right? And so there's grace given on all parts, and recognizing that we are all humans and no one is better than the other. So that's my take on this movie series, psychologically, spiritually. And if you guys have any response, please let me know in the comments. Peace and love.